how do you replace the stake on your staked plants? That's what we're doing today. The big challenge here is removing the aerial roots very carefully because they are attached to the support and we don't want to damage them when we take them off. First, we need to make our moss pole. When we're measuring for a moss pole, I like to go about a foot taller than the longest vine. So what I'm going to do is bust out my measuring tape and we're going to give a little rough estimate. This vine comes up to 30 inches. So I'm going to go up and make a 42-inch moss pole so that we have some room to grow up the pole without having to replace it so soon. Next, we need to measure how tall the pot is. This is going to be our new pot. This is the pot we're going into from the old one. We need to measure how tall it is because obviously if the PVC pipe is below the soil, it doesn't need to have our material on it, our cocoa fiber. So we're just going to track it all the way up to here and mark it so that we know where to start our cocoa fiber going up. Now we're going to measure and cut our cocoa fiber. So remember, we're going to only go down to the line that we have right here. I like to do a little test rollover to make sure that I'm cutting off enough fabric to completely cover the entire PVC. Then I'm going to mark that off and then just cut a relatively straight line all the way to the top. I like to go a little bit above the PVC pipe just in case my measurements are a tiny bit off. It's nice to be able to trim it down because you can always take away, but you can't necessarily add on in a very fashionable sense. Next thing we want to do is secure the string to the anchor or the bottom of the pole. I just give it a quick little two tie. It's important to remember also the reason we're using PVC pipe is whatever's below the soil is going to get very wet, obviously, when you water your plant, and PVC pipe doesn't rot like a lot of the other woods do, so this is going to last a really long time. It's also nice that when the plant outgrows the pole, you can just add on to the pole at the end and not have to take your plant out of its stake as we're about to do with the other plant. So now I'm just going to fold this over and we're going to start to spiral it to the top. There's no rhyme or reason. You can be as messy or as precise as you like, whatever fits your needs. Or your personality, maybe. All right, now we're just going to tie it off here at the top. Sometimes this feels like I need a couple of hands to do this bit. In fact, tying it off is probably the hardest part about doing this whole project. All right, and we did have a little bit of extra right there. I'm not going to cut it down below the PVC. I'd want to cut it right above it, actually, just to cover up any of that unsightly PVC pipe. We don't want to distract from the natural beauty of the plants. Now we've got our moss pole. It's time to take this plant off of its moss pole and replace it. We talked a little bit earlier about the challenge of getting the aerial roots to detach from whatever they're on. And depending on what they're attached to, the method can be different. When they're attached to wood, I just use water and I kind of spray it on the wood to make both the root and the wood wet, and it's going to help it sort of detach in a way that's not going to rip a lot of the aerial roots. We're trying to conserve as many as we can. Next up, we're going to repot the plant. I just like to give it a little squeeze on the side, and then usually it'll come out after that. There we go. Ooh, we got some nice roots on this one. She was definitely ready for a repot. At this point, I'm going to unravel a little bit of these roots. Again, we're going to break some of them, but it's going to help it grow into its new pot really well. So you can imagine we're going to have soil below it, so these roots are immediately going to go in there and start spreading around. When they're swirled around like that, they don't as readily grow into their new soil, their new pot. So we like to break up a little bit. Same with the sides. I'll rough up the sides a little bit. Not too big of a deal. Yes, we are going to damage some roots, but it actually stimulates root growth. Now we need to find a spot. We need to make a spot for our moss pole because we want it to be in the center. We don't want to be too far behind. We want it to be right in the center of the action. So we're actually going to break this apart right here and make ourselves a little groove, a little channel for them to go into. And then we're going to enclose the moss pole around it. We have right here. And again, we're just going to place our bare end in there first. We're going to snuggle it in around there. And then look at this. We're going to close it in around. At this point, I like to tie up just probably the main stem, just to say that the plant is attached to it while we put it into its new pot. It's a little bit easier if the two are connected, even if it is kind of haphazardly at the beginning. Now this won't be our permanent tie for this plant, but again, just connecting the two entities while we go to the next part. We'll sort of fine tune it as we go along. Next we've got our new pot, okay? It went from, whenever you're repotting a plant, we only go up 1 to 2 pot sizes. So this was in a 6-inch pot. This plant was in a 6-inch pot previously. We're going up to an 8-inch. You can see there's not a whole lot of size difference, but that's really beneficial. It makes plant care so much easier when we do it that way. For soil, we're going to be using 1 part houseplant soil mixed with 1 part orchid bark. You can also throw in some perlite or some horticultural charcoal, something that's going to retain moisture but still be freely draining. And we also like these big orchid barks to create a lot of airflow to the roots, which is really important for your aeroids. That's how we can prevent root rot, right? So judging the amount of soil that you want in there is kind of a trial and error. For that, I like to, so I don't have to bring the plant up and down, I just use the previous pot. What you want to do is have the soil level and the moss pole level right up to about 1 inch below the absolute height of the pot. So I'm aiming for right about here. So I know where the soil level was on this plant, so I can measure it against there. I put a little bit too much in, so I'm going to remove just a hair. Try again. And now we're sitting right at about 1 inch below the surface of that one, so I know we are in the right ballpark for getting this baby in here. Now we're going to pick up the entire thing, moss pole, plant, the whole shebang, and we're going to lift it into this pot and make sure that it's nice and centered. I also like to ensure that the pole is inserted into that soil below as well. And now it's just a matter of backfilling. So let's get our soil. We're just going to start dumping it in. There's a couple important things at this level. One, we want to make sure that we're getting all the roots. We don't want any negative space in there, right? So how we make sure that happens is whenever we put soil in there like so, we're going to spread it around and we're going to tap the sides. Tapping the sides is going to get all those little particles to fall in between all of the roots, because what you don't want to happen, if soil is not coming into contact with the roots, then they're not going to have any moisture. They can't take moisture up to the leaves, which isn't really that big of a deal unless it happens to a lot of roots, because if those roots don't get moisture, they're going to die off and you're going to have root loss, and then your plant isn't going to be looking as healthy. So we tap the sides of the pot. Sometimes people will give it a little pickup and a little tap like that. That's fine as well. And we firm in the soil around it as we go. Each layer we want to be firmly held in the pot, especially when we have a moss pole, because this is extra weight and it's tall. So we need to make sure it's really secure in the pot as we go. Keep on backfilling. Again, we're going right up to that line where it's about 1 inch below the absolute height of the pot. Don't be too worried about being messy at this stage. Repotting is kind of a messy ordeal in and of itself. It's probably why a lot of people drop their plants off here for me to do it. We don't want to push down so hard that we are breaking any roots, but we do want to make sure it's nice and firm. So use your best judgment. I like to use my hands for that so that I can feel the amount of pressure a lot better than if I were to be using any different object. As you go, you want to check your work. Stand back, check your work. Make sure that the pole is standing upright, vertical, how you want it to look. And you can adjust the pole one way or the other, firm the soil around it, and that's going to sort of keep it in place. It's important to check your work as you go around to make sure you're not getting an end result that you don't want. All right, so the soil level is definitely high enough on this character. So now all we have to do is attach the plant to the pole. At this point, it's going to be sort of up to you to determine how you want your plant to look. If you have it up against a wall, maybe you just put all of the leaves and the stems on one side so they can all be viewed. Or maybe you have it where people can walk everywhere around it. In that case, maybe you want to kind of spiral around the pole so that it can be viewed in the leaves and the vines can be viewed from all angles. Doesn't really matter which you do, but just keep in mind that little tidbit. So once you kind of have the look that you want, then you can start doing your tying. I like that one right there. I'm actually going to tie these two vines at the same time. When you're selecting something to tie your plant up with, the material that you use is actually important. The general rule of thumb is to always use something that is softer than the vine or the plant that you're using. So in this case, I'm using the same twine that I use to tie up or to make the moss pole. I'm using that material to tie up the plant as well. This twine is more soft than the actual plant. If I were to use something like a wire, like a metal wire, like a fishing line, for example, over time that would cut into the plant and possibly cut it all the way through and damage the plant. So we want to make sure we're using something soft. So here you have it, your finished product. Now, if you just keep it tied up, that's perfectly fine. Some people really want the aerial roots to attach though. If that's the case, you want to tie your nodes right directly in contact with the cocoa fiber. The other thing you can do to help the aerial roots attach to the fiber is to keep this constantly wet. So you can mist it as many times as you want throughout the day. Keeping the humidity up really high around the plant and around those aerial nodes is what's going to help the plant attach to the actual pole. But again, it's not totally necessary.